I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. I have some stories to tell. By Search and Rescue Woods. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that you guys might be interested in. Now, I guess I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of them either wander off a path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. A majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't quite happen. And both kind of bother me a lot. I use them both as motivation to search even harder on the next missing person case I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. The parents lost sight of him just for a few seconds, and in that time, both kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find him, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly. When asked where her brother was, she said that he had been taken away by the Bear Man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the Bear Man, and he seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found any trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls we've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other one was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed a tree to get a better view of the forest, but she never came back down. They waited at the base of that tree for hours, calling her name before they called us for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a single trace of her. I have no idea where she possibly could have gone, because neither her mother or her grandpa saw her come down from the tree. A few times, I've been out searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with 0 possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's got to be an explanation, but it's sort of strange, isn't it? One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into an ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and that part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She just couldn't live with the loss of her daughter, I guess. For this one, I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we had received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get where we figured he would be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant, to say the least. He had been there for almost 2 days, and the leg was obviously seriously infected. We were able to get him to a chopper, and we heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He was talking about how he'd been doing just fine, and that when he had gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment or anything, He was just wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said that he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. To be honest, I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things to ever happen to me involved the search for a young woman who had gotten separated from our hiking group. We were out until late that night, because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotten log. She was missing her shoes and pack. She was clearly in shock, but she didn't have any injuries. We were able to get her to walk back to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us, asking why that man with the big black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock, right? But the closer we got to base, the more agitated the woman got. She kept asking us to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started just yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her back to moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. I guess you could say it was insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of the base ops, the woman turned to me, her eyes about as wide as I can imagine a human could possibly open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He tells me to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at that scar on your neck." I have a very, very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman could have saw it. Right after she said that, I heard that weird cough right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. We hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was. But I have to say, I was really happy when we left that area that night. This is the last one I'll tell for now, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken thing. A regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably most likely won't say anything. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all kind of gotten used to it to where it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we are really far off in the wilderness, I'm talking like 30 or 40 miles out, at some point, we will find a staircase right in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs out of your house, cut and pasted them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw one, and another officer told me not to worry about it, that it was just normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing, and I wanted to go check him out, but I was told, very empathetically, that I should never, ever go near any of them. So I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. I do have a lot more stories, so I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell you some of them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about the stairs or anyone who's seen them, let me know. So, I logged back on tonight and was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seems to have generated. First off, I'll address a few things that you guys have brought up. There has been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarity between my stories and those of David Paulites. I assure you that I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for the guy. He's actually what inspired me to write these down, because I can verify a lot of the stuff he talks about. We do have a lot of these strange missing person cases, and most of the time they aren't solved. Either that, or we find them in places they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, but I'll share a few I've seen and a story my friend told me that relates to this. There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly, and I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins. Others are brand spanking new. I saw one set that looked like it came out of a lighthouse. They were spiral and metal, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go up infinitely, or farther than anyone can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures. It's never really occurred to me to try to get them after the first time. I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I can't promise anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the other climber ascended the top and reached the peak, he saw another man in parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. Sorry about the confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. Alright, on to the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say half the calls I get are related to that. The other rescue calls, people who fall off cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by a fire, you wouldn't believe how often this happens. Mostly to stupid drunk kids. Or getting bit or stung by an animal or an insect. We're a tight team. We have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes the cases where we find no trace of them so frustrating. One particular one was upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than it did answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a pretty well-established trail. His wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and suffered one out on the trail. Now, before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. But I don't ask about that kind of thing, because past a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Someone's missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found sign that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering just about as much ground as we possibly could. Suddenly, a call comes out over the radio telling us to head back to the vet's location. And of course, we come right away because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we need a full team to get him back to safety. Once we meet back up, the vet is just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the side of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and he points up to one of the branches in the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 or so feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle had been looped around a branch, and it was just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious that no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring the canines out, but they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is just called off, because there are other calls we have to attend to. Past a certain point, there's just nothing we can do. The guy's wife calls us every day for months, asking if we found her husband. And, it was heartbreaking hearing her get more and more hopeless at each call. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it's just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How the hell did the guy's cane end up in the tree? Did someone kill him and toss it up there as some sort of weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids, that's the most heartbreaking. It doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under. It's never easy. And we always dread the ones that we find deceased. Now, it's not common, but it does happen. David Polites talks about a lot of kids in the SAR teams find in places they shouldn't be, or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones I think about a lot that I witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area at the side of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, the other is about 3. She is watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never let any of them out of her sight for any amount of time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs up their stuff and starts to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost from getting there to the parking lot, unless you're deliberately going off the path like some kind of imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her, when she hears a sound. It sounds like someone's coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she wasn't looking, her 5-year-old son just vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee or something. She asks the other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and then led him off into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged. They were sort of spacey and fuzzy. So of course, naturally, she freaks out and starts looking frantically in the area for the kid. She is screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer. Now, obviously, she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got 2 other kids right there. So she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We respond and we start to search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. The canines can't pick up a scent. We can't find any clothing or broken bushes, literally anything that would signify a child being in the area. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she is just completely destroyed by the whole thing. We look for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help too. But eventually, the search kinda peters out, and we do have to move on. The volunteers do keep searching though. One day we get a call on the radio, letting us know that a body needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there anyway. About 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid that we had been looking for. I've been trying to figure out how this kid got to where he did ever since we found him, and I've never came up with a good answer. A volunteer just happened to be in that area. He figured he might as well look at places that no one else would think to look, on the off chance that the body was dumped. He comes across the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up he sees something. He looks through binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed into one of the little openings in a rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in. And we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get the body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he started, but there's no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. The slope is treacherous. It's hard even for us with all of our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way in hell of getting up there. Of that, I am just absolutely certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. So it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what I can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by this point, and it looked like he'd almost been dead for, at most, a day, maybe 2. The whole thing was just unbelievably strange. And this was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined that the kid died from exposure. He froze to death. Probably late at night, 2 days before anyone found him. There are no suspects and no answers. To date, this is probably one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs had such a strong scent and trail, and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about a half a mile where he had been seen last. The kid wasn't even aware that he had wandered off that far. One of our vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm really not that good with kids. And, I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me where one of the hot spots are, where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people usually move downhill because it's easier. So we hike out there. It's a few miles away, and we get back in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, she's pointing out places where people are found in the past, and I see something off in the distance. Now, listen, this area is about 8 miles from the main parking area, but there are some back roads you can take to get closer if you don't feel like hiking that far. But we're on state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out there. The most you'll see is a fire tower or a makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with. But I can see from where we are that whatever this thing is, it has straight edges. And if there's one thing you learn pretty quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I pointed out, but she doesn't do anything. She just kind of hangs back and let me wander over to check it out. I got within about 20 feet of it, and the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. It's a staircase in the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of it being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see what it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load in completely, and the stairs are the only thing that's visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try to make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there, casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what the fuck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckles and says, "Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them." I start to move closer and she grabs my arm, hard. "I wouldn't do that," she said. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight, and I just stand there looking at her. "You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them." I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells me it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, within a mile or 2 or 3. Sometimes they're 20, 30, 50 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. And I only find them on the broadest of searches, or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for years. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion, and they were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal. Don't go close. Don't go up them. Now, when my trainees ask about it, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in the winter, when realistically no one should be that far out on the trails. We close a lot of trails, but some remain open all year round, unless there's just a shitload of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy amount for snow that year. And we knew that it wasn't likely that we would find him until spring when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw was there, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. Right away we knew what had happened, and it scared the living shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or who spend any time on a mountain would probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees, because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of the tree that's a filled mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. We call them tree wells. They're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the Welcome Center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are, but every year we get an unusual amount of snow. At least one person just doesn't read them, or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we found out about it in the spring. My best guess was that this young man was hiking and he got tired or maybe a cramp, and he went to go sit at the base of a tree, not knowing there was a tree well, and he just fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding area of snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in really, really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be fatal. What scared me was just imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down in the freezing cold. He didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out of. As it got harder to breathe, he must have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goat Man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing. But then again, I didn't see anything. However, there was this one call where I had something kind of similar happen. But I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the Goat Man. We had gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back to the main area. We hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs, to us and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife just starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her and she's just passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and we were able to get her down to the welcome center. She comes to and just starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what happened. I can't remember what she said verbatim, but essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she was hearing this really strange noise. It sounded like sort of a cat, but it was off somehow, and she couldn't figure out why. She went a little way ahead to try to hear it better, and it sounded like something was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy that she was, until finally she figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part, because it was so weird, I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man, saying the word meow over and over. Just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been. Because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it, and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I was. And the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I'm a little perplexed as to why a guy would be out in the fucking woods chanting meow meow at people. So once we had gone down the mountain, I told my superior I'm going to search the area to see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab a radio and hike back to where she was. I don't see anyone. So I keep going about a mile more, and when I go back, I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It was almost sunset by this point, and I don't have any desire to be out here alone at night. So I sort of just write it off and make a mental note to check out the area again tomorrow. But as I'm headed back, I hear something in the distance. I stop and I call out to anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. But the sound didn't come closer or louder. But it did sound exactly like a man saying, meow, meow, in this really odd monotone. As comical as it sounded, it was almost what that guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get any closer. It's almost like it's coming from all the directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I end up just going back to the welcome center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been just some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit, it was weird. So, this kind of turned into a massive wall of text. I apologize. I wanted to get the stories that my friend told me, and he does have some good ones. So, I'll post those tomorrow evening. I also have a few more of my own I think you guys will like. I'm so sorry to keep you in suspense again, but hopefully these stories here make up for it, and you can get through the next 24 hours until I can post again. Edit. Since all of you seem to like and would like to hear more, I'll write up as many stories as I can and do a massive post tomorrow. I'll include my friend's stories, and I'll see if I can't get a hold of a few people who might have interesting things to talk about. I wasn't sure how people felt about big, giant walls of text, but if you're all okay with it, I'll post lots of stories. Well, once again, you guys have blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to these stories. There's no way I can respond to each one of you individually, so I'm just going to address more common things again, then move on with the stories. I'm gonna write as many as I can think of, in addition to my friend's stories. I'll probably not update this again until I get a chance to answer some questions that I have for my superiors. Alright, so the common questions I found that you all had. I am not comfortable exactly talking about where I work. Unfortunately, in all reality, some things I've mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble, or fired. So it's best that I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I am in the United States, and I'm in an area that's comprised of a great deal of wilderness. We're talking hundreds of miles of thick forest, with a mountain range and a few lakes. There is still a great amount of interest in the stairs, and luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think all of you will be very interested in. I'll go into that more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I thought of asking my superiors about them, I have, but again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former superiors no longer works for the SAR office, and it's possible that he may be willing to talk to me about it. I'll be speaking to him later on in the week, and I'll let you know how that turns out. As far as advice on becoming an SAR officer goes, I think the best advice I can give is go to your local Forest Service office and see if they offer training courses, or what the qualifications are. I've been doing this for years, but I started out as a volunteer helping on SAR operations. It's a great job despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. Alright, let's move on to the stories. This first happened on a case that I went out on right after going out into training. I was still pretty new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I kind of had a basic idea of what to expect, but on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets have found signs of them. As an SAR officer, you go out on all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. This case got called early in the morning from a young couple who were out on the trails that go by a lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. We could hear the woman screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. When we get there, we see him holding his wife, and she had something in her arms. She was screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams, and he was sobbing. When he sees us, he screams at us to help them, to please get an ambulance up there now. Now, obviously, we can't drive an ambulance up the walking path, so we ask him if his wife needs help or if she can walk down on her own. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife who needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down, and I ask the wife what's going on. She's rocking and holding something, just shrieking over and over. I crouch down to see whatever it is that she's holding. It's covered in blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front and my heart sinks. I ask her what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms open gently so I can see what she's holding. It's her baby, obviously dead. His head was caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation just hits me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself, and I get up and go get one of the other vets who is standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid, and he sort of just pats my shoulder and tells me he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see the kid. By the time we try to take him from her, she flips out and tells us that we can't have him. That he'll be okay if we just leave her alone to help him. But eventually, one of the vets managed to calm her down and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMTs showed up, they told us that there was never any hope of saving the kid. He died instantly from trauma to the head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital. She told me later what had happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with the baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussing. The dad takes the kid and is holding him, looking over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to him, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil. As she trips, falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling down a hill about 20 feet into this gully onto the rocks on the bottom. The dad climbed down to recover the kid, but he had fallen on his head. He was dead by the time the dad got down there. The baby was only about 15 months old. It was a total freak accident, and a series of events that coalesced into the worst possible outcome. That's probably one of the more awful calls I've been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as an SAR officer, mostly because there aren't that many animals that come in the area. While there are bears, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see around here are small ones, like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we do see frequently, though, are moose. And let me tell you, moose are some nasty fuckers. They'll chase after anything for any reason. And God help you if you get between a female moose and its baby. One of the more amusing calls I was on was a guy who had been chased down by an absolutely massive male moose, and the guy was stuck in a tree. It took us almost an hour to get him down, and when he finally got on solid ground again, he looks at me and says, "God damn, them fuckers are big up close." I guess it's not really a scary story, but we still laugh at that one. I honestly don't know how I had forgotten about this story, but this is by far the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it just didn't come to mind right away. As someone who spends literally all of their time in the woods, you don't ever want to get yourself scared of being alone, or out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experiences like this, you tend to forget all about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me seriously consider if this was the right job for me. I don't really like thinking about it too much, but I'll do the best I can to remember it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl wandered away from her family's campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent, and they told us what most parents do. "My kid would never wander away. She's so good about staying close. She's never done anything like this before." We assured the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her, and we spread out in a standard search formation. I was partnered with one of my good buddies, and we were sort of casually walking as we hiked. I know it sounds callous, but you sort of become desensitized when you've done this as long as we have. It becomes the norm. And I think to a certain extent, you kind of have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to get the job done right. We were searching for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where she could have been, and we came out of a small valley when something made us both stop in unison. We froze and looked at each other, and there's almost like this sensation, like a plane depressurizing. My ears pop and I have this odd feeling, This odd feeling of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt that, but before I can, we hear the loudest noise ever. And I mean the loudest noise I've ever heard in my entire life. It's almost like a freight train was passing directly by us, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above and below. He screamed something at me, but I couldn't hear him over this deafening roar. Understandably freaked out, we looked all around us trying to find the source of the sound, but neither of us sees anything. Of course, my first thought was a landslide, but we're not near any cliffs. And even if we were, it definitely would have hit us by now. The sound goes on and on and on, and we're trying to yell at each other, but even standing close together, we couldn't hear anything but this sound. Then, as suddenly as it starts, it stops, like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stood there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly the normal sounds of the woods come back. He asked me what the fuck just happened, and I just kind of shrugged. We stand there looking at each other for a minute. I get on the radio and ask if anyone heard the end of the fucking world, but no one else heard it, even though we're all within shouting distance of each other. My buddy and I just sort of shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we all check on the radios. No one's found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark. But because we don't have any lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep close together, and we're calling out for her every couple of minutes. At this point, I'm hoping beyond hope that we find her. Because while I may not like kids, the idea of them being out here all alone in the dark is awful. The woods can be intimidating to kids in the daylight. At night, well, it's a whole different beast. But we're not seeing any signs of her or getting any responses. And around midnight, we decide to turn back and head towards the rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines the light to our right, into a really thick deadfall, or a group of dead trees. I asked him if he heard a response, but he just told me to be quiet for a second and listen. I do, and in the distance, I can hear what sounds like a kid crying. We both call the girl's name and listen for any kind of response, but it's really faint crying. We headed in the direction of this deadfall and go around it, calling her name over and over. As we get closer to the crying, I start to get this weird feeling in my gut, and I tell my buddy that something definitely isn't right. He tells me he feels the same way, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we are and call the girl's name again, and at the same time, we both figure it out. The crying is on a loop. It's the same little hitching sob, wait, then a quiet hiccup, repeated over and over, exactly the same way, every time. And without saying another word, we both just take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost my composure like that, but something about it was so incredibly wrong, and neither one of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous point, we asked if anyone else heard anything strange, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know this sounds kind of anticlimactic, but that call had me fucked up for a long time. As for the little girl, we never found any trace of her. We keep an eye out for her, and all the other people who we've never found a body from. But frankly, I doubt we'll ever find anything. Of the missing persons calls I've been put on, only a handful have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person, nothing. But sometimes, finding a body leads to more questions than it does answers. Here's some of the bodies that we found that have become infamous on our team. A teenage boy whose remains were discovered almost a half a year after he vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera, almost 40 miles from where he had been seen. The camera, sadly, was destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who vanished a month earlier. That was all we found. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy on the highest peak of the ridge in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome, almost 20 miles from where she vanished. She had died of exposure 3 weeks after going missing, and all of her clothes were intact except for her shoes and jacket. There were berries and cooked meat in her stomach when they did the autopsy. The coroner said it appears as if someone was taking care of her. There were no suspects ever identified. The frozen body of a 1-year-old baby, found a week after vanishing, in the trunk of a hollow tree 10 miles from the area where he was last seen. There was fresh milk in his stomach, but his tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and a right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl, found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground where her parents had been that previous summer. Now, onto a couple stories that my friend told me. I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs, and you're in luck. He's had a closer encounter with them than I have, though he doesn't have any more explanation for them, but he does have a bit more experience with them than I do. My buddy has been an SAR officer for about 7 years. He started when he was a junior in college, and he had a very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him almost the exact same thing mine did, which is never go near, touch, or ascend them. For the first year, he did just that, but apparently his curiosity got the better of him. On one call, he broke away from the line and went to go check out a set. He said that they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished. The dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they were from a new house, because the carpeting was pristine and white. He said the closer he got, he didn't feel any different or hear any weird noises. He was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing, but he got right up next to them and didn't feel anything. The only thing he said was odd was that there was absolutely no debris on the steps. No dirt, leaves, dust, nothing. And that there didn't appear to be any signs of animal or insect activity in the immediate area, which he also found strange. It was less like things were avoiding them, and more like they just happened to be in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and he didn't feel anything, except that sort of sticky feeling you get from the carpet. Making sure his radio was on, he slowly climbed the stairs. He said it was terrifying because of the way they had been stigmatized. He wasn't really sure what was going to happen to him. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported into some other dimension, and the other half was watching for a UFO to come swooping down. But he got to the top with little event. He just stood there, looking around. But he said the longer he stood at the top step, the more he felt like he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as if it was the feeling you get when you were in a part of a government building you weren't supposed to be in. As if someone was gonna come arrest you or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger. And that's when he realized he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds of the forest were gone. He couldn't hear his own breathing. It was like some kind of weird, awful tinnitus, but way more oppressive. He climbed back down and rejoined the search. No mention of what he had done. But he said the weirdest part came after. His trainer was waiting for him back at the welcome center after the search ended for the day. He was cornered by my buddy before he could leave. He said the trainer had this intense look of anger, and he asked what was wrong. "You went up them, didn't you?" My buddy said it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how the trainer knew. The trainer just shook his head. "Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost her scent." My buddy asked what it had to do with anything. The trainer asked how long he had been on the stairs, and my buddy said no more than a minute. And his trainer gave him this really awful dead-eyed look. And he told him that if he ever went up another set of stairs again, he would be fired immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he never answered the question that my buddy asked him about it. My buddy's been involved in a lot of missing person cases where there's never been a trace found. I mentioned David Polites, and my buddy said that he can confirm that those stories, for the most part, are accurate. He said that most of the time, if the person isn't found right away, they're either never found, or they're found weeks, months, or even years later, in places that they couldn't possibly have gotten into. One story he told me really stood out. It involved a 5-year-old boy with severe mental disability. The little boy vanished from a picnic area late in the fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped. His parents explained over and over that he simply could not have vanished. It was impossible. Someone had to have taken him. My buddy said they searched for the kid for weeks, going miles out of the accepted range. But it was like the kid had never been there. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent anywhere, not even in the picnic area where he had vanished from. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was pretty clear that they were devastated and hadn't done anything sinister to their own kid. The search was concluded about a month later, and my buddy said that everyone had pretty much forgotten about it by the winter. He was out on a training op in the snow in one of the higher peaks. He came across something in the snow. He said he saw it from far away at first, and when he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking partway out of the powder. He recognized it as belonging to the kid, because it had a very distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, lying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said there was no way the kid had been dead for more than a few days, but he'd been missing for almost 3 months. The kid was curled around something. When my buddy brushed off the snow to see what it was, he said he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He said that it was a big chunk of ice that had been carved crudely to sort of look like a person, and the kid was holding it so tight that it had frostbit in his chest and hands. My buddy could tell, even with the decay that had taken place. He radioed in the rest of the crew and they took the body off the mountain. Now, he recapped all of this for me and put it simply that there was no way the kid had survived out there for 3 months on his own, or gotten to this peak. There was no physical way the child could have walked almost 50 miles and ended up on the top of a goddamn mountain. And to top it all off, there was nothing in the kid's stomach or colon. Nothing. Not even water. It was like my buddy said. The kid had been taken off the face of the earth, put in suspended animation, and then dropped down the mountain months later, only to die of exposure. He never really got over that one. The last story I'll share from him took place relatively recently, only a couple of months ago. They were out doing recon for mountain lions because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. One of our jobs is to scout out areas where these animals are seen, to ensure that if they are in the area, we can warn people and close off those trails. He was out in one of the very heavily forested parts, towards dusk, when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming off in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, It sounds exactly like a woman being brutally murdered. It's unsettling, but far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back to let ops know that he had heard one, and that he was going to keep going to see if he can figure out where its territory was. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, always from the same spot, and determined the approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another scream, this time within only a few yards of him. Of course he freaks out and starts heading back at a much faster pace, because the last thing he wanted to do was run into a goddamn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he got back on the path and started heading back, the screaming followed him, so he broke into a jog. He was about a mile from ops. The screaming stopped. He turned around to see if it was following him. It was almost night at this point, but he said in the distance, just before the path rounded a corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning them that the path was closed, and that he needed to come back to the welcome center. The figure just stood there. My buddy started to walk over, and when he was about 10 yards away, he said the figure took, as he described, an impossibly long step toward him and let out the scream that my buddy had been hearing. My buddy didn't even say anything. He just turned and sprinted back to ops, never looking behind him. By the time he got back, the screaming had moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anyone else, just said that there was a mountain lion in the area and that they needed to close those paths until it could be caught and moved. I'm gonna end this entry here, since it turned into another huge wall of text. But I'm going to be heading out on a yearly training out tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until early next week. I'll be meeting a lot of former trainers and buddies who work in the areas of the park, and I'll be asking about any stories they'd like to share. I am really so glad you guys have been interested in these stories, and once I'm back from this op, I'll continue to share them. Hey guys, I'm back from my training out, and I have a lot of really interesting stories to share with you. I've got enough that I'm going to break them up into 2 parts, this being the first. I'd love to put them all in one entry, but I just haven't had a chance to write them all down yet. I didn't have anything too crazy happen while I was out there, but we did have one incident with a rookie that I still found kinda relevant. Since I'm sure you guys have been waiting for these, I'll just get right to the stories. I'll assign each batch of stories to the person that told them to me. KD. KD is a vet who's been an SAR officer for about 15 years. She specializes in high elevation mountain rescues, and is widely considered one of the best in her field. She was one of the more enthusiastic storytellers, and since we were together a fair amount of time during the exercise, she ended up telling me about 4 that really stuck with me. The first she told me asking about her most traumatic calls. She shook her head and told me that really bad calls happen more frequently up on the mountain, since potential for nasty accidents is significantly higher. About 5 years ago, one of the parts she works at had a string of disappearances. It was a bad year, she said. One of the worst on record as far as weather goes. They were getting about a foot of new snow every couple of days, and there were a few avalanches that killed some climbers. They warned people to stay in the mapped areas, but of course there are always those who just don't listen. In one particularly nasty case, an entire family got wiped out because the father decided that he knew better than the officers and the officials, and he took them out to an area that just wasn't safe. They were snowshoeing, and as best as KD could figure out, they walked onto a shelf that looked solid, but it actually wasn't. It gave way, and this family went ass over tea kettle almost 300 feet down a slope. They landed at the rocks at the bottom and the parents died instantly. One of the kids did as well, but the other two survived. One had a broken leg and fractured ribs. The other was almost unharmed, save for some bruising and a sprained ankle. The uninjured child left his sibling behind and set out to find help. KD said that the kid didn't make it more than a half mile or so before the storm just overtook him. The kid stopped to try to get warm or maybe to rest, but ended up freezing to death. They ended up finding the family with the help of some witnesses who saw them heading out into the wilderness. And she was the one to find the kid who had frozen to death looking for help. She said it had started to snow, just enough to obscure long-distance vision, but not enough to make searching impossible. She saw a figure sitting up ahead in the snow, and she got to it as quickly as possible. She described, in detail, how that when she got closer she realized first that it was the child, second that they were deceased, and third that they had frozen over one of the most pitiful positions she had ever found a corpse in. The kid was sitting upright, knees tucked up against his chest, his arms wrapped around him and his head tucked into his coat. She moved and took the coat off of his face, and she saw that he died crying. His face was twisted, but there were tears frozen on his cheeks. She said that it was painfully obvious that the kid was terrified when he had succumbed to hypothermia. As a mother, it just broke her heart. She told me repeatedly that she hopes the father is burning in hell as we speak. The other traumatic story she told me about stood out in my mind was the one that happened when she was a rookie. Her team got a report of an experienced climber who hadn't come home the previous day. His wife was concerned that something bad had happened, because he never failed to come home. They went out looking for him and had to climb what sounded like some very technically challenging parts of the mountain. They got to a relatively flat area when Katie started to see blood in the snow. She followed the trail, and as she went, she started seeing little bits of tissue. She wasn't exactly sure what part of the body they had come from, but the further she followed it, the more there was. She follows this blood and tissue trail to a sheltered area under a cliff face, and there she finds the climber. She said there was so much blood it was more than she had ever seen before. He was lying face down, one arm stretched in front of him, almost as if he had died crawling. She looked closer and could see that he was partially disemboweled, which was obviously where the tissue had come from. The guy had his ice pick turned into his hip holster, and it was just covered in blood. Of course, they'll never be exactly sure what happened, but she said the best she can figure this is what went down. The guy had been attempting to climb into the next area, and he was using his ice axe to ascend. He'd probably hit a loose patch of dirt and fallen. On the way down, or possibly when he landed, he had gotten impaled by the axe, and that is what disemboweled him. He dragged himself along, tearing pieces out of himself as he went, and he died under the cliff face. She isn't terribly bothered by gore, but I guess a few of the guys who came to help out and to help her take the body threw up when they turned him over, and a good portion of his intestines spilled out too. I mentioned to her that I was interested in hearing about any experiences she had with people completely disappearing. Her eyes lit up and she leaned close to me. "You want to hear a real doozy?" she asked. She tells me about how, when she first started, there was a case that got a lot of attention in the media. A family had been out berry picking in an area of the forest that was close to the entrance of the park. They had 2 little boys, both of them under the age of 5. At some point during the day, one of them just vanishes. There's an absolutely massive search, and they find absolutely nothing. It's another one of those cases where the kid was just never there in the first place, you know? The dogs just sit down and don't pick up on anything. Not even a trace of the kid is found. The search goes on for about 2 months, but is eventually called off. Fast forward to 6 months later, The family comes back to place flowers at a memorial that had been set up there for the kid. They bring the other son. While they're placing flowers, they lose sight of the kid for about 3 seconds. And in that span of time, he vanishes directly into thin air. Now, obviously, the parents are devastated. It's terrible enough to lose one child, but losing both is just beyond imagination. The search is huge, one of the largest in state history. There are about 300 volunteers combing every inch of the park looking for the kid. But again, there's no trace of him. The search goes on for about a week, with people looking miles from the part of the park where he vanished from. And then, almost 2 weeks later, a volunteer almost 15 miles from the designated search area radios in that he found the kid. They had assumed that the kid was dead, but the volunteer said he's not only alive, but he's in good shape. KD and her kid go out to recover the kid, and when they get there, they can't believe that this kid had been missing. His clothes were clean, there's no dirt on him anywhere, and he doesn't even appear to be traumatized. The volunteer said he found the kid just sitting on a log, playing with a bundle of twigs that had been bound together with old rope. KD asks him where he's been and who he had been with for those 2 weeks, and the kid tells her that he's been with the Fuzzy Man. Now, KD firmly believes in Bigfoot, so of course she gets all excited and asks, what does he mean by fuzzy? Was he hairy? But the kid says no, he wasn't hairy, he was a fuzzy man, and describes the man to be blurry, like when you close your eyes but not all the way closed. He says the man came out of the trees and took the kid deep into the woods. The kid says he slept in a hollow tree, and the fuzzy man gave him berries to eat. KD asks if the man was mean and if he scared the kid, but the kid says no, he wasn't scary. But I didn't like that he didn't have eyes. KD says they get the kids back to headquarters and the cops take him to talk more about what happened. She's friends with the cop that talked to him. She said the kid described as being kept in the tree by this fuzzy man and given berries whenever he was hungry. He was allowed to wander around a specific area, but when he tried to go further, the fuzzy man would get man and yell real loud even though he didn't have a mouth. The kid got scared at night and the fuzzy man made it go brighter, and he gave him that twig bundle. He said that the fuzzy man was going to keep him, but he had to let him go because the kid wasn't the right kind. He either can't or won't elaborate any more on that. The cops are sort of just left scratching their heads. The search for his brother is renewed with no results. The kid has no idea where his brother might be, and they never find him. The last story that Katie told me was of something that happened to her when she got separated from her training group when she was a rookie. She was learning the basics of high elevation on a well-mapped side of the mountain, and she had to use the restroom. So she went off about 50 yards from the group during a meal break and did her business. The rest I'll tell you exactly as she told me. So I go to take a piss, and once I'm done I start going back to the group, but I've only gotten 5 feet when I realize I have no idea where I am. And this wasn't an oh I got turned around lost. I mean, I literally had no fucking clue where I was. If you asked me, I don't even think I would have been able to tell you what state we were in. It was sort of how I imagine people with amnesia feel, you know? You're completely lost and have no idea what to do. So I just stood there for a while, trying to figure out where the fuck I am and what I was supposed to do. But the longer I stood there, the more confused and turned around I got. So I started walking. As I recall, I just picked a random direction and went for it. As I'm walking, it's just getting worse and worse, to the point where I don't even know why I'm on a mountain in the first place. I'm just trudging through snow, and then I start hearing this voice. It's kind of inside my head, almost. Like if a frog could talk, all low and croaky. And it's telling me over and over, it's okay, you just need to find something to eat. It's okay, Find something to eat and you'll be okay. Just keep walking and find something to eat. Eat. So I start looking around for anything I can eat. And I swear to God, I've never been more hungry in my entire life. It was bottomless, and I think I had just eaten about anything you would have put in front of me right then. I had no concept of time, so I had no idea how long I had been out there when I heard an actual voice coming towards me. I go toward it and see it's another one of the SAR officers, and he looks fucking terrified. He's running towards me, asking me if I'm okay and what the hell I was doing out there. And the scary thing was, as he's running towards me, I see myself reaching for my hunting knife in my belt. And I'm not even really thinking what I'm doing, but what I'm thinking is I have to eat. If I don't eat, I'll never be okay again. So I just have to eat. He sees me doing this and he backs off right away. He yells at me to put my knife away and that he's not going to hurt me. And that all kind of snaps me back. All of a sudden, I know exactly where I am and I put the knife away. I run toward him asking how long I'd been gone, thinking he'll tell me like a half an hour or so. But he tells me I was gone for 2 fucking days. I had gone over 2 peaks and ended up on the other side of the mountain. And if I kept going, I would have ended up wandering into about 300 miles of wilderness. They would have never found me. He can't believe I'm not dead. And of course, I don't know what the fuck to think. To me, no time had passed at all. I don't say anything, I just go back with him to the rendezvous point and I'm taken to HQ and airlifted to a hospital. When I get there, they do all kinds of tests to try to figure out what happened. As best they can guess, I was in some kind of weird fugue state, which is kind of like amnesia, or had a weird seizure that knocked my brain out of whack. But the truth is, we don't really know. It's never happened again, but let me tell you, ever since, I never go up there alone. People rag on me for making them come with me when we have to leave the group, but I just tell them that listening to me take a piss in the snow is a lot better than losing me for 2 fucking days on a freezing mountain. The next person I talked to was EW, a former trainer who now works as an EMT. He still comes to ops like this to help out, but doesn't work full time for us anymore. He specialized in finding lost kids. He just seemed to have a sixth sense of knowing where they had gone. He's a legend among the senior vets too. But he gets embarrassed if you compliment him on his work. He sat down with me at dinner one evening and we ended up swapping stories. Most of them were just casual, but we got to the subject of our weirder calls. I mentioned that I had a buddy who had gone up a set of stairs. He kinda got quiet and asked me if I heard of a little boy who disappeared from this park a few years back. I hadn't, so he told me the story. They were out looking for this 11-year-old boy, Joey, who had gone missing near a river. Of course, the first thought was that he had fallen in and drowned. But when they got the dogs out, the dogs led the SAR officers away from the river and up into a densely forested area. When we do searches, we search in a grid pattern, and we search every box of the grid incredibly thoroughly. What EW's team noticed right away was that a very strange pattern was emerging. Dogs in alternating squares were picking up Joey's scent, but losing it when they overlapped into another box. Think of it like a checkerboard. Joey's scent was being picked up in random black squares, but never in the red. This, of course, didn't make any sense, because how could a kid bounce from one area to another without leaving a scent over each area that he had passed? EW's and his partner look into a new grid of the box. EW notices a set of stairs about 50 yards away. He tells his partner that they need to go check out the area near it, but his partner flat out refuses. He tells EW that he made it a point never, ever to go any stairs that he sees, and that while it may be routine, he's not pretending that it's normal. He tells EW that he'll wait in sight while EW checks. EW says he's irritated, but he felt for the guy and didn't want to push him on the subject. So I walked over to the stairs and they were small, kind of like a set that goes into the basement. I don't feel really strongly one way or another about them. The stairs, I mean. So I wasn't scared or anything. I guess I'm like everyone else. I just prefer not to think about them too much. Anyway, I went over and I could see that there was something lying on the bottom step, sort of curled up. My heart sinks because, of course, you always hope for the best. And we were confident that we would find this kid alive, because he had only gone missing for a few hours, but right away, I knew it was him and that he was dead. He was curled up in a little ball on the step holding his stomach. It looked like he had been in horrible pain when he died, but I didn't see any blood, except for some on his lips and chin. I radioed in that I had found him and that his body needed to get back to command. That fucking poor family. They were just devastated. The parents couldn't understand how he'd been dead, because he had only gone for such a short amount of time. And on top of that, we didn't have an obvious cause of death, which made it worse. I figured he had probably eaten something poisonous since he was holding his stomach when I found them, but I didn't want to guess. It's hard enough to hear that your kid is dead, let alone some stupid search and rescue guy asking about what happened. They took him away, and I went home and tried not to think about it. I hate finding dead kids. Man, I love this job, but it's one of the reasons I left. I've got 2 daughters, and when I think of losing them, He choked up a little here. I'm not great with emotional stuff like that, and it's always sort of awkward to see a grown man cry, so I didn't know what to do. He pulled himself together eventually, though, and kept going. We didn't hear back from the coroners about the cause of death. It's not really our job to know, I guess. And sometimes if they think there's foul play, they won't tell us because of legal bullshit. But I've got a friend who works for the sheriff department, and he'll usually pass along anything interesting if I ask. In this case, though, I actually got a call from him about a week later. He asks if I remember the kid, and of course I do. He says that some seriously weird shit is going on. He tells me, "EW, man, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but the coroner has no idea what happened to this kid. He's never seen anything like this in his life." My friend goes on to tell me that the coroner opened the kid up and he couldn't even believe what he was seeing. The kid's organs were like Swiss cheese. Quarter-size holes were punched clean through every single organ the kid had, aside from his lung and heart. But his colon, his stomach, his kidneys, and even one of his testicles were full of these clean holes. My friend said that the coroner described it as if someone had taken a hole and punched holes through everything. They were so neat, but the kid didn't have a scratch on him. No entry or exit wounds, nothing like that. The closest anyone had ever seen was a guy who had filled himself full of buckshot a year or so back while cleaning his gun. No one had a clue what could have possibly caused this. My friend asked me if I ever heard of anything like it, or anything similar in the past, but I have definitely never even heard of something like that, and I told him that I wasn't going to be of any help. As far as I know, the coroner determined the cause of death was something like massive internal bleeding, but no one knows what really happened to the kid. I've never been able to forget that kid, and I have nightmares about it sometimes. I don't let my girls go into the forest alone, and when we go together, I never let them out of my sight. I used to love to be out there, but that case and a couple others just sort of ruined it for me. Dinner was over, so we started to clean up and head back to our cabins, but before we went our separate ways, he put his hand on my shoulder and looked at me real close. He tells me that there are bad things out there, things that don't care if we have families or lives, or that we can think and feel. He tells me to be careful, and he walks away. I didn't get a chance to talk with him again, but that story stuck with me. By pure coincidence, I got to talk to another vet, PB. who's been in the SAR field for years. We were partnered on a grid sweep during a training exercise. We were chatting casually about how much we liked the job, what kind of things we've seen and stuff like that. At one point, we passed an old set of stairs that was probably from an old fire lookout. Given the area that we're in, I casually mentioned that I was curious about the stairs, and that I wished to know more about them. He got kind of quiet and looked at me like he wanted to tell me something, but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, he told me to turn my radio off. Obviously, this is something we're never, ever supposed to do, but I did, and he did the same. He tells me about 7 years ago, he was out on a call with a rookie. They were in an area of the park that had a lot of strange reports and events. Disappearances, stories about lights in the forest, odd noises, things like that. The rookie was totally spooked and kept going on about the things in the woods. According to PB, the guy wouldn't stop talking about the goat man. Just on and on, goat man this and goat man that. Finally, I told him that there was plenty else to be afraid of out here that was real, and that he'd better get over this thing with the goat man. The rookie wanted to know what kind of things I was talking about, and I just told him to shut up and walk. We crested a little ridge and there was a staircase about 10 yards ahead. The rookie stopped dead in his tracks and just stood there, looking at them. I tell him, see, that's something to be afraid of. The rookie asks me what the hell they're doing out here, and for some reason, I just open up and tell him the truth. Or what I've been told is the truth. I could have gotten in a lot of trouble for doing what I did, and I could get in a lot of trouble for repeating it to you, but you're a nice kid and I want you to stop looking into this. Quit while you're ahead. So, I'll tell you what I know. Under the condition that you never breathe a word of this to your soups. I told him I wouldn't say a word, and he double checks that our radios are off. When I first started out, we were a little less tight-lipped about them. Other things that happen out here, you know? We would warn people before we even hired them that there was weird shit going on. I guess the Forestry Service was tired of such a massive turnover rate, and they wanted people to know what they were getting into. So they started having people sign these agreements that they wouldn't go to the media about whatever they saw. The Forestry Service didn't want to scare people away, so the last thing they needed were spooked rookies running off to the media with ghost stories and haunted stairs. But eventually, they found that the agreements weren't necessary. People not only didn't want to talk about what they saw, they wouldn't talk about what they saw. A few times the media tried to get people to talk when kids or hikers would disappear, and no one would say a word. I can't really explain it. I guess we just don't really want to admit that anything's wrong. This is our job, and to be out in the woods every single day, we don't need to get spooked. And the best way to do that is to pretend like everything's okay. So, I'll tell you everything I can think of, and after that, I'm done talking about it. For good. And I expect you not to bring it up around me. Ever. The stairs have been out here as long as the parks have existed. We have records going back decades describing them. Some people go up them and nothing happens. Other times... Look, I don't really like talking about this, but sometimes really bad shit can happen. I saw one guy get his hand sliced clean off as he got to the top step. He reached around and touched a tree branch, and it all happened so quick. 1 second his hand was there, and the next it was gone. It was a completely clean wound. We didn't find his hand, and the guy almost died. Another time, a woman touched a set of stairs and a blood vessel in her brain exploded. Literally exploded, like some kind of water balloon. She sort of stumped down and came over to me. All she got out was, "I think there's something wrong with me." And she dropped like a sack of flour. Dead before she even hit the ground. I'll never forget the way the blood leaked into the inside of her eye. Before she died, I watched it turn red. I watched it happen, and there wasn't a single thing I could do to help. We warned people not to go anywhere near them, but there's always at least one jackass who does. And even if nothing happens to them, something bad does always happen. Kids go missing as we're on their trail. Someone dies the next day, cut in half completely in a safe part of the park. I don't know why, but something bad always happens. I don't know exactly why they're out here, but it doesn't matter. They are here, and if we're smart, we tell our new officers exactly what they're capable of. We both went quiet for a little while. I was afraid to talk because I wasn't sure if he was done. He looked at me like he wanted to say something else, and finally he spoke up again. Have you ever noticed how you can't find the same ones twice? I nodded, expecting him to continue, but he just stayed quiet, walking alongside me. Eventually, he just started telling me the story about the biggest deer he'd ever seen in the park. I didn't bring up this subject again, and I didn't want to press him for any more stories. He dropped out of the op the next day. Apparently, he left before the sun came up and said he was sick. None of us had heard from him since. I'm going to stop here for the time being. I'll try to post the next part in the coming days, but with it being the end of summer, things get pretty busy here. Thanks for the continued interest, guys. You've really awakened up this curiosity in me that I didn't even know I had. I apologize for the short update, guys. Things have gotten a little crazy around here, and I'm not sure how often I'll be able to update going forward. I really do appreciate all the support you guys have given me, and while I only have a couple stories to share with you, I'll definitely be interested in what you think. A firefighter at the time of the training op told me about this call he had gone on, supposedly to help rescue a kid from an absolutely massive tree. He said they didn't give him details, just that they needed him to come out and they lacked the proper equipment. He had been called out specifically because the thing was so huge that the SARs didn't feel safe trying to climb it. He'd been a tree trimmer before he joined the VFD, so it was easy for him to grab his old equipment and come out and help. He was let out about 2 miles, and the team stopped at one of the biggest trees in the area and pointed up. He laughed and asked the op captain how the kid made it up there. Made some joke about the old cat in a tree thing, but the captain just shook his head and told him to get up there and get the kid down. He said he knew something was up, but he didn't push it. He said that he climbed the tree. He started wondering if they were playing a prank on him. There was no way a kid would have been able to make it up this fucking thing. It was massive at the base, and about halfway up it started tapering. I almost turned back a few times because I really didn't think it was going to hold me. But he said he kept going, and when he got to the top, he saw a flash of blue on the branches. I saw the kid's shirt caught in a branch, and I called out to him, asking if he could come to me. But he didn't say anything. I kept moving, calling the kid's name and telling him not to be scared, that I was there to help him. By the time I got to him, I knew he wasn't going to answer me. I found him, or what was left of him, cradled in the fork of a branch. And the fact that he was up there was sheer luck. If he had fallen any other way, he'd have come crashing down. It wouldn't really have mattered, though, because this kid was dead long before he ended up in that tree. I don't know who put him there, or how, or why, but it was fucking sick. The kid's intestines popped out of his mouth and they were hanging in the branches. It was like it was some sort of fucking sick Christmas tree. The way they were draped over everything, it was fucking awful. I got a better look and saw they had even popped out of his ass. His guts were hanging out the bottom of his pants and his eyes were just gone. I assumed they were pushed out by whatever force caused him to pop like a fucking stress ball. You ever see a body that's been floating in the water for a long time? How their tongues kind of swell up and stick out? He was like that. I remember because there were fucking flies crawling all over it. I think I must have gone into shock or something because, man, I pushed that kid down with a stick I broke off a branch. I just kind of poked him until he fell. I don't know why I did that. I almost lost my job because of it. But, man, the thought of hauling that kid down over my shoulder the whole way, gathering his guts and coiling them around me like some kind of rope so they wouldn't get snagged, I couldn't even do it. I've seen a lot of dead kids, more than I'd ever admit. I've seen a kid who hid in a bathtub full of water during a house fire. It boiled him alive, turned him into literal soup. But this, I didn't know what did this, and the thought of touching that kid's body made me feel like I would lose my mind. I heard him hit the ground and I figure everyone would freak out, but they knew he was dead and that's why they sent me up there. They didn't say anything. They didn't shout or freak out or anything. I got to the bottom and got right up in the captain's face, asking him why he was sending me up there when they knew damn well the kid was dead. But he told me it was none of my concern and thanked me for getting the evidence down. I remember the way he said that. I remember it specifically because it was so weird to hear it phrased that way. The evidence. Like he wasn't even a real person. Like he had never been a little kid who got lost and something fucking unspeakable happened to him. The captain and crew led me back out of the woods, but he and 2 others stayed behind. I thought that was weird too. Why wouldn't they help me get the kid out? I tried asking the guys leading me out and they just told me they couldn't discuss an open case. I asked him what he thought happened to the kid and he got really pensive and thought about it for a bit. I would have said crash injury based on how his guts came out like that, but with those injuries, you see massive contusions under the skin. Obvious trauma. This wasn't like that. It was almost like this kid got caught in a big vacuum and his guts got sucked out. But even then, there was no trauma. None at all. It bothers me, man. It bothers the hell out of me. One of the vets at the training app reads No Sleep, and he recognized my stories. He knows me pretty well, and we've swapped stories before. He asked if I could share something that he's noticed about the stairs, and some thoughts he had as well. I'm really glad you decided to share these. I think it's important that people are aware of what's out there, especially since the Forest Service does a good job of covering it all up. I asked him what he meant. What do you mean, what do I mean? The lack of any kind of media attention? No coverage of missing kids or bodies found miles from where they got lost in the first place? David Paulites hit it right on the head. The Forestry Service is doing everything they can to keep people coming here, even if it isn't safe. I mean, to be fair, it's not like these things happen every day, but the numbers add up and it's worth looking into. Especially the stairs. I was surprised you didn't even mention the flippy ones. I didn't even know what he was talking about. I couldn't remember anyone ever talking about something like that. He seemed somewhat incredulous. Dude, I can't believe you've been with us this long without seeing them. No one told you about them? I just shrugged and asked him to elaborate. Well, there's the normal stairs, the ones that pop up and that go out a ways. I know you know about them. But sometimes I've ran across ones that are flipped upside down. I guess it would be like if you had a dollhouse and the stairs were its separate piece. Now, flip it upside down so that the top step is in the dirt, and put it out in the middle of the fucking woods. They're like that. I don't see them often, but they're odd, to say the least. Makes me think of footage taken after a tornado, when houses are blown apart and random things are left standing, like a chimney or garden walls. Those ones, they freak me out more than the normal ones because I can't write those off as easily. I don't scare very easily, like most of us who work out here, but that idea stuck with me, and it bothers me. I'm going to try to find out more about them. He also mentioned how many people are bothered by the guy with no face. He got really excited and told me that he had seen something similar. I was out on a training exercise a few years ago, and I was camped out in my tent, and I heard something walking around outside the camp. We're told not to wander far, which you know, so I wondered if maybe it was a rookie who had gotten up to pee and couldn't find his way back. You remember that guy in our group a few years back who almost fell off the damn mountain? Well, I'm paranoid about that happening again, so I got up to see what was going on. I went to the edge of camp and called out to whomever it was and told them that camp was this way. But they just kept going back out into the woods. So, naturally, I went after them. I know it was stupid, but I was half asleep and I just really didn't want to deal with some idiot getting hurt. So I followed this thing on dead straight course for about a mile, and then it stopped near the edge of a river. I could see the vague outline of it because the water reflecting the moon. It looked like just an ordinary guy. He had a pack on, and it looked like that he was facing me. I asked if he was okay and if he needed help, and he just kind of cocked his head to the side like he didn't understand me. I always have this pocket knife on me, and it's got this little thumb light attachment to it. So I turned it on and lit up his chest so I wouldn't blind him. He was breathing slowly and deep, so I wondered if he was sleepwalking. I went closer to ask him if he was okay, and I moved the light up. And something didn't seem right, so I stopped. He kept breathing in his real slow, deep breaths, and I sort of figured out gradually that that's what was bothering me. It was like he was pretending to breathe, but not actually doing it. His breaths were too even and deep, and his movements were kind of exaggerated, like his shoulders going up and his chest moving out. I told him to identify himself, and he made this muffled noise. I moved the light up, and I shit you not, this guy had no face, just smooth skin. I freaked out and I fumbled with my light, and I saw him moving towards me, but he didn't actually move. I don't know how to explain it, but 1 second he was at the edge of the river, and the next he was 5 feet away from me. I never even looked away or blinked. It was like he moved so fast that my brain couldn't keep up. I tripped and fell on my ass, and I could see this line open up on his throat. It stretched up to his ears. His head tilted back, and he smiled at me with his throat. There wasn't any blood, just this gaping dark hole. And I swear it was a smile. A smile back at me with the gash in his throat. I got up and ran as fast as I could back to camp. I couldn't hear him following me, but I always felt like he was right behind me, even though when I looked back I couldn't see him. I calmed down when I got to camp, and the fire was still going, so I guess the pack mentality of being around other people made me stop and, breathe a little. So I waited by the fire to see if he followed me, but I didn't hear anything for a few hours, so I went back to bed. I know it sounds weird, but the whole thing was just so surreal that it almost felt like I immediately wrote it off as my imagination. We were telling ghost stories one night before bed just to scare each other and poke fun at whoever got creeped out. Most of the time, it's the rookies, but one woman told a story that actually managed to get under my skin a little bit, and I know it must have been the same for others. She said it was true, but then again, every story told around a campfire is true. Somehow, though, I don't think she was making it up. It had that ring of truth that only really traumatizing events have. She said that when she was a kid, she and her friend used to go play in the woods behind her house, that she lived in northern Maine. There was a lot of dense, unpopulated national forest area. She said the woods weren't like they are here, that they're so thick in places that the trees block out the sun completely. She and her friend grew up there, so they weren't really scared of being out there alone, but they always maintained a sense of caution in certain areas. She said that it was never really talked about, but they always knew not to go out more than a mile or two beyond their homes. The adults never said why, but it was an unspoken rule that no one ventured out too far. She said that her friend made up these stories about bears as big as houses that lived out there, that they used to scare each other by hiding and making growling noises while the other one searched for them. She said one summer there was this awful storm that blew down a lot of trees and set part of the forest a few miles behind her house on fire. Fire crews got it under control, but she said some of them came back not quite the same. It was almost like they had been to war. You could tell who had really gotten scared because they had the same look on their faces. I think it's called shell shock. My friend said that they were like walking dead people. They didn't smile or say anything if you went up to them, and most of them left town as soon as everything was over. I asked my parents about it, but they said they didn't know what I was talking about. Once everyone had been told that the woods were safe again, my friend and I decided to hike out to where the fire had been. We didn't tell our parents where we were going. It was pretty exciting to think that we were disobeying them that way. We hiked out about 2 miles or so. We started seeing burnt trees and stuff. I remember that my friend got really upset when we found the skeleton of a deer curled up under a tree. I practically had to drag her away from it. She wanted to bury it, but I didn't want her to touch the antlers because they were weird. I can't remember why, I just remember thinking that there was something wrong with them, and I didn't want either of us to even go near it. The farther we went, the more burnt that everything had gotten. Eventually, there were just no standing trees. It was almost like being on another planet. There was almost nothing green, just brown and black everywhere. We were standing there looking at all of it, and we both heard someone shouting in the distance. I panicked because I thought it was my dad and that he was going to yell at me and tell me that I was grounded. My friend broke off and hid behind this big rock because she said she didn't want to get caught out there. Her parents had forbidden her to go out into the woods at all, and she had lied and told them that we were going to a movie. I followed her, but we kept listening. I could hear this voice getting closer, and I realized that they were calling for help. I thought that maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost and needed directions back to town. That kind of stuff used to happen all the time, so I was used to helping people out. I could hear him following my voice, so I kept calling out to him in the distance. He got closer and closer, and I could see that his face was all red. I told my friend to give me her pack because she had a first aid kit in it. She made this noise that she was grossed out or something. She asked if I saw his face, and I told her to shut up. I jogged over to meet him. I stopped about halfway when he stopped in front of me. I could see that his nose, lips, and part of his forehead were just gone. It was like they had been sliced clean off. He was bleeding bad, and I saw that the knees of his pants were red too. I took a step back, but I was too scared to move too much. He grabbed my shoulders, and I felt like I got a shock, and he jerked back. He started babbling, and I couldn't tell what he was saying, except that he kept asking how long he had been gone. He asked me where his unit was, but I just shrugged my shoulders. He looked me over and saw my Walkman and screamed. He just kept babbling and touching his face, and I realized he wasn't wearing the right clothing. He had some kind of weird gray cloth jacket and formal pants on. The jacket had these weird buttons outlined in red borders on it. I just kept shaking my head and told him that I didn't understand what he was saying. I went to open the first aid kit, but he just screamed again, and the only thing I could really understand was, "Don't touch me. You'll make me go back there." After that, he just kind of ran off. I could hear him screaming the whole time. When I couldn't hear him anymore, I turned around and my friend was crying. We just turned around and started walking back towards town. She asked me over and over who that was, but I didn't say anything. When we got home, I told her that I didn't want to play in the woods with her anymore. We're still friends, but we don't talk about that guy. Not ever. I'll update as soon as I'm able to, guys. I really appreciate the continued support. It's been way too long since I posted an update, and I am sorry about that. There's also been some confusion about the new formatting requirements on the board, which I've cleared up. So the next few stories are going to be posted a little bit differently. They'll be in chronological order. I'll do my best to tie them into each other as much as possible, so it doesn't skip around too much. When I started out as a rookie, no one told me about all the weird things that would happen. I'm guessing this is largely to prevent me from freaking out and abandoning the park. But a few months into my service, when I was still a rookie, a friend and I were drunk at a party, and he opened up a bit. Yeah, it can get a little crazy out here, I guess. I think the worst is when people die that just shouldn't, you know? Or we find them dead, and like 10 minutes after someone said they saw them. They were fine when I passed them on the switchback, I swear. That sort of shit. Like, take this guy who I found one spring. He was out on a really popular trail. Someone comes into the VC freaking out about some guy who's laying in the middle of the path in a giant pool of blood. So, we run out there. We find this guy dead as a doornail. Which he absolutely should be, because the back of his head is like mashed potatoes. His skull is just decimated. Brains are leaking out like custard filling. And this guy's old, so you figure, yeah, he probably fell and hit his head. Old people fall all the time, no big deal. Except the area where he fell doesn't have any big rocks. There aren't even any stumps or tree branches. And on top of that, there is no blood trail. So he clearly died where he dropped. Now, that's when you turn to murder. But there were people just out of the line of sight of the guy. If someone came up and murdered him, there's no way they wouldn't have heard it. And again, if someone had, there would be a blood trail, or splatter all over the place. But everyone on the scene said it looked exactly like he had fallen and smashed his head on the rock. So what the fuck did he hit his head on? And then there was this lady I found in a different park about 5 years ago, back when I was in a different part of the state. We found her in the middle of a stand of big junipers, curled around the trunk, like she was hugging it. We picked her up to move her, and a fucking waterfall comes out of her mouth, splashes all over my shoes. Her clothes are dry, her hair is dry, but the amount of water in her stomach and lungs was phenomenal. It was just unreal, man. Coroner's report says the cause of death was drowning. Her lungs were completely full of water. This, even though we're in the middle of the high desert and there isn't a body of water around for miles, no puddles, no nothing. No sign of anyone else being out there. I mean, yeah, it's possible she was murdered, but why go out of your way to do it like that? Why not just stab him and be done with it? I don't know. Just sits weird with me, I guess. Now, of course, that freaked me out a little bit. But we were wasted. I guess I sort of wrote it off as a fluke. I also assumed there was exaggeration there, since, we were wasted. Now, I don't like talking about this next case very much. It was just an awful one, and I've done my best to forget about it. But of course, that is easier said than done. This happened about 6 months after the conversation with my friend at the bar, and up until that point, I hadn't really had any weird shit go down. A few things here and there, and of course, the stairs, but amazingly easy to get used to stuff like that when it's just treated as normal. This case, however, was a it was a bit different. A guy with Down syndrome in his 20s went missing after his family lost sight of him on a major path. That was odd in and of itself because the kid never left his mom's side. She was absolutely convinced that he had been kidnapped. And unfortunately, a ranger who isn't with the park anymore insinuated that no one would want to kidnap someone, well, with that kind of disability. Not very tactful to say the least. We wasted a lot of time trying to get her to calm down, just enough to get information about him. And we put out an official missing persons call. Because of the urgency of the situation, him mostly unable to function alone, we had the local police come in and help us. We didn't find him in the first night, which was just heartbreaking. None of us wanted to think of him being alone out there. We assumed he had just kept wandering and was staying ahead of us. We broke out heedless the next day and spotted him in a little canyon. I helped to bring him back up, but he was in bad shape. And I think we all knew that he wasn't going to make it. He had fallen and broken his spine and he couldn't feel his lower half. He'd also broken both of his legs. One at the femur. He lost a lot of blood. He was confused and scared while he was alone. So he probably exacerbated his injuries by dragging himself a little ways. I know it sounds awful, but while I was riding in the copter with him, I asked him why he wandered off. I just wanted something to tell his mother, to let her know that it wasn't her fault. Because he was fading fast and I didn't think she would get to ask him herself. He was crying. And he said something about how the little sad boy wanted him to come and play. He said the little sad boy wanted to trade so he could go home. Then he closed his eyes, and when he woke up again, he was in the canyon. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said, but it's what I thought was the gist of it anyway. He kept crying, asking where his mommy was. I held his hand and tried my best to keep him calm. It was cold out there, he kept saying. It was cold out there. My legs were frozen. It was cold out there. It's cold in me. He was getting weaker, so eventually he stopped talking. And he closed his eyes for a while. Then when we were about 5 minutes from the hospital, he looked right at me with big tears running down his face. He said, "Mama won't see me no more. Love Mama. Wish she was here." And he closed his eyes and he just never woke up. It was horrible. I don't like talking about it. That was one of the first cases that really rattled me badly. Because of how badly it affected me, I reached out to a senior ranger who ended up helping me through it. As time went on, we got to know each other better. He ended up sharing one of his own stories with me. It was disturbing, but it helped knowing that I wasn't the only one affected by the things going on out here. I think this must have been before you got here. I think if it happened while you were here, you would have remembered it. I know it didn't end up on the news for some reason. But I think most people who have been here long enough kind of know about it. The park sold off a portion of land to a logging company. It was a real controversial thing, but it wasn't that large or old of a plot. And it was right after the recession, so we needed the cash badly. Anyway, they were felling this plot of land and we got the call that we needed to get our supervisors out there right away. I don't know why, but they ended up sending me and a few other guys along with the heads. I guess powers and numbers? To see what was up. When we got there, we saw all these guys crowded around a tree that they had just cut down. They're all pissed off and freaking out, and the foreman comes over and he wants to know what we think we're up to. "What the hell y'all think this is? Some kind of sick joke? You've got a lot of fucking nerve pulling this shit. We bought this land fair and square." Well, we don't know what the hell he's talking about, so he brings us over to this felled tree and points at us and tells us it was like this when they cut it down. And that they'll be damned if they put it there. The inside of the tree was rotted and hollowed out in one spot. When they cut it down, it exposed that chamber, and inside of it is a hand. like a perfectly severed hand. It looks like it's actually been fused inside of the tree. Now, we think that they're pulling some kind of sick joke, so we tell them that we don't like being fucked with and that we're gonna leave. But they tell us that they already called the cops and that they'll go right to the media if we don't stick around. Well, that gets the head's attention, so they stick around and talk to the police about it. Everyone is denying they put the hand in the tree, and besides, how would anyone have even done it? It's clearly a real hand. It's not mummified or skeletal. It's brand new, probably not even a day old, and it's fused with the wood. You can see how this is coming out, right? The loggers, they insist they didn't put it there, but somehow a fresh human hand ended up fused inside of a living tree. The cops have them cut out that section of the tree into a movable chunk. Then they take it away, and the area is closed off. There was a pretty big investigation, but as far as I know, they didn't get any answers. Now it's kind of become a legend. And as far as I know, we haven't sold off any more property for logging. As well as you know, I've been to a training seminar recently, and I've heard some pretty amazing and horrible things there. One of the guys I talked to was telling me a story one night around the campfire. We were both pretty drunk. You'll start to see a pattern here. And we were all swapping stories. He told me this one. Me and another guy were out on a field research for campers that reported hearing screaming noises at night. So we head out there for whatever fucking mountain lion had wandered into the area. And I am pissed. I've seen 3 of them show up in the camping areas that year alone, and I'm getting tired as hell of constantly having to deal with them. Plus, I just don't fucking like them anyway. They're a pain in the ass, they're loud, and they scare the shit out of me. Fucking cats. Pieces of shit. I'm groaning, and the guy I'm with thinks it's a real fucking riot. So we start seeing all these broken branches, and what looks like dens, so we're pretty sure we know where the fucking thing is. So I call it in, and they tell me to confirm if possible, which they want to know if I step in a big pile of shit and use that as proof. I'm not seeing any though, so I basically tell them to shove it and that I'm done. We know where this damn thing is out here, even if I'm not stepping in its shit or its big fucking mouth or whatever. Guy I'm with wanders off to take a piss, so I'm standing behind watching this little burrow under a tree to see if maybe a fox or something is living under it. 'Cause I love foxes, man. They're cute as hell. Anyway, I'm watching this tree and I start to hear these branches crackling, and it's coming from the direction opposite my partner went. Now, I've got my pistol, and you and I both know that's not gonna do shit against a cat. So I cock it and holler for my partner to get his dumb ass back. He's gone too far. He can't hear me. So I stand up and get my sights on where the thing is approaching. And I fucking shit you not, man. I just about peed myself. This guy is coming towards me, and he's backflipping through the fucking woods. Like, instead of walking, he's doing these crazy fucking backflips. I swear to God, he cleared every log and bush in his path. It's like he knew exactly where he was going. I yell at the guy to stop where he is and that I'm pointing a gun at him, but he keeps coming, and I just kinda lost it. I shot the ground in front of him. It was a dumb fucking thing to do, but man, I didn't want this guy anywhere near me. When I fired, he was about 50 yards away, and as soon as my gun goes off, he whirls around and starts backflipping back into the woods. My partner hears my gun go off and he runs back and asks what's up. I tell him that there's some fucking weirdo out here, hopped up on God knows what, and that we need to get the fuck out of Dodge. I let the cops know what happened, and I didn't get any trouble for firing. But man, I don't know what that motherfucker was on, but I've never seen anything like it before. Shit was absolutely buttfuck crazy. I think we can agree that there's stuff going on out in the woods. While I'm not going to spout off about what it could be or offer any theories, what I want people to take away from this is that it is so damn important to be safe while you're out there. I know a lot of you think you're invincible, but the fact is, you can die out there, or get hurt, or go missing. It's easier than you'd ever imagine. I apologize for this relatively short update, guys. I will absolutely do my best to continue this series as soon as possible. Thank you for all the continuing support. It does mean the world to me. One of the topics I get asked about a lot, on here and in real life, involve things like the rake, the Wendigo, and other related legends. I can't honestly say that I know a lot about them, but based on some light reading I did, I can say that I've heard stories that seem loosely related to them. You've heard the old adage that legends like that come from somewhere, right? And I'm sure that's true. But as you all know, I try to take things with a grain of salt. You kind of have to out here. It's sort of like working in a hospital, I'd imagine. You could spend all day thinking about how many people have died there, and how there are probably ghosts, or whatever you want to call them, all over the place. But it doesn't do you any good. It just makes it harder for you to do your job. I think a lot of us feel that way, and that's why we just go on and pretend like everything is fine. Once you get paranoid, there's not really any going back. A lot of cadets quit because of it. My park especially seems to have a high turnover rate, because cadets graduate, get so freaked out about everything, and they just seem to not be able to let it go. You have to learn to internalize things and just shut it off. I talked to Katie about her experiences because I wanted to know what she thought about the Wendigo. She didn't really have anything particular to say about it. Aside from that, she didn't like to think about it very much. But a friend of hers told her something similar that had happened. I contacted this person, H, over Skype, and they agreed to talk to me a bit. They're aware of my work here, and they're fine with me posting the story exactly as they told me. I grew up in Central Oregon, and there's a reservation called Warm Springs, about 1 or 2 hours from where I lived. I only mention that because a lot of people in my area had friends there, and a lot of the land in that area belongs to that tribe. When I grew up as a kid, we used to go camping there. Not on the res, of course, but in that area. I met a lot of kids who grew up there. I got to know one kid pretty well. His name was Nolan. We ended up hanging out a lot when our families were in the area. Our folks would get in touch with each other so we could all go camping around the same time. We'd camp out for about 2 weeks, so we were out there for a long time. I asked him if he camped in an RV. Yeah, my dad had one. So I guess it wasn't really camping, but we'd take our tents and stuff and set them up away from camp most nights. I didn't like sleeping in the RV because, well, I like being outside. We talked a bit about camping. Anyway, sorry. One year, Nolan and I were out there. I think I must have been 12 or so. We wanted to go camp near a river because we wanted to try night fishing. I think that we must have been about 1/3 of a mile away from the main camp. Far enough that we couldn't hear or see anyone else. I remember that. We were messing around most of the day. I don't really remember much about it, but we ended up building a fire at some point. And I remember being really impressed because he had a flint or something that he used to start it. I've never seen anyone do that before, so I thought it was really cool. I got him to teach me how to do it, and we lit some stuff on fire. Looking back, it was pretty stupid because it was in the middle of fucking summer, and I remember the fire warning was at an either yellow or an orange. But thankfully, we didn't start anything major. And when it got dark, we sat around and talked about whatever it is 12-year-olds talk about. I don't even remember. What I do remember is that, at some point, he looked over my shoulder at the river, and he asked me if I could see something. The way our camp was set up, we were about 10 feet from the river, and we were at its widest point, so I think it was probably 12 feet to the other bank. It gets hot up there in the summer, but the water's still cold, which is important. I looked over my shoulder and I could see something wading into the water from the other side. From where we were, it looked kind of like a deer, but I couldn't really tell because of the fire. I got up to look closer and I saw a pair of antlers, so I figured that it was a buck. But I thought that it was weird that it was wading into the water, and it was definitely headed for us. I asked Nolan what he thought we should do. He looked at the fire with this weird expression, and he tells me to sit down and shut up. So I do, because I've never seen him act that way before. He's whispering at me to ignore it, but he just keeps talking like he couldn't think of anything to say. He keeps saying something about an episode of some show, but I can hear the deer coming through the water, so I wasn't paying attention to him. I keep trying to look over his shoulder, and every time I did, he would sort of hit me in the arm and make me look at him. I remember I wasn't really scared, but just sort of confused. But then I hear the deer come out of the water, and I could kind of make out what it looked like. I realized it wasn't a deer because whatever it was walking on two legs. I started to get up. I was super freaked out, but Nolan yanked me down and talked louder about this television show. I could tell that he was probably just as scared as I was, probably even more. He leaned in and started poking the fire with the stick, and he whispered, "Whatever I do, I can't speak to it." I could see it come closer, and it stood right behind Nolan's back. I was about ready to pee my pants, and I think I probably would have run if I had been alone, but I didn't want to leave Nolan. So I kept sitting really still and sneaking glances at it. It wasn't that tall, but the way it carried itself was just wrong. Like its center of balance was screwed up. I can't really describe it, but it kind of like kept shifting forward too far. It just stood there, behind Nolan for a long time, and eventually Nolan ran out of things to say. We just kind of sat there for a second. The fire was making noise, but I could hear this thing, whatever it was, talking in kind of a really low voice. I couldn't hear what it was saying, and I leaned in a little bit, and I actually did pee my pants when I leaned forward too. I couldn't see its face, but I did see its eyes. They were cloudy and milky. If you want to know what they look like, find that scene from Lord of the Rings where Frodo falls into that lake and all the dead people are floating toward him. That's what its eyes looked like. So all I saw were these two milky white things floating above Nolan's head, and a really vague shape of antlers coming out. I don't know what my face looked like, but at exactly the same time, Nolan and I fucking booked it out of there. We ran non-stop until we got back to the main camp. My pants were soaked with pee, so I took them off while we were running and threw them into the bushes. We both stopped once we were in front of my dad's RV. We couldn't see the thing chasing us, so we just stood there and caught our breath. I asked him what it was, and he said he didn't know. He said his grandpa had only warned him that if anything ever came up to him when he was out in the desert, he should never, ever talk to it or listen to what it has to say. I wanted to know if he'd heard it talking too. He said that he was only able to understand "help you." I think we ended up sleeping in the RV with my parents, and the next night we went back to see if we could find anything, but we couldn't see anything. That does, in a lot of ways, remind me of the Wendigo legend. There's a phrase used to describe it that I think fits perfectly, which is that the Wendigo is the spirit of the lonely places. I know sometimes when I'm out in the wilds, where I know there's no one around for miles and miles, I get this weird craving that I can't really explain. I don't know if this happens to anyone else, but it's just this desire to consume. It's not like I crave anything in particular, but more of this weird, distracting hunger that comes from every part of my gut. I also wanted to find out more about the Faceless Man if I was able to, and I found a few similar things. I asked around my circle of friends, and one of them said that they were doing repairs at this park in the area, and he saw something kind of like that. We were having dinner in town, 5 of us, including myself. This guy, he was repainting an information booth, and he heard a man ask him for directions to the nearest campsite. He didn't turn around because he was up on a ladder, but He informed the man that there weren't any campsites nearby, but if he headed down the road about 4 miles, he'd find one at the national park. He asked if he could be of any other help, and the man said no, and thanked him. My friend said he kept painting, but he was listening, and he never heard the other man leave. The second he came up and talked to me, the hairs on my neck stood up, but I wasn't sure why. I just had this really uneasy feeling about the whole thing. I just wanted to finish painting and get the hell out of there. I figured part of that was because I couldn't turn around to look at him, but something definitely felt off. There was also this weird smell floating around before the guy even talked to me, kind of like old period blood. I had looked around to see what was causing it, but I didn't see anything. So I waited for the guy to walk away, but I didn't hear him leave, which made me think he was just standing there and watching me. So I asked if I could do anything for him, and he didn't answer. I knew he was there, though, because I haven't heard him leave. So I did this awkward turn on the ladder to look at him and to see what he was doing. Now, I admit, it could have just been my brain fucking up for a second, but I swear to you, Russ, for a split second when I turned around, that fucker didn't have a face. Like, he had no face. It was almost concave and totally smooth. I just about had a fucking heart attack and I couldn't even wrap my brain around what I was seeing. I think I started to say something, but there was this kind of pop inside my head and suddenly he was just a normal looking guy. I must have looked weird because he asked me if I was okay. And I said, yeah, I'm fine. He asks about the campsite again and I point out where he has to go. He's like, I'm not from around here. Can you help me get there? Now, that's when I knew something was really up, because no way this guy got out here and had no idea where he was. And for that matter, there was no car around. So how'd he get here in the first place? I said I couldn't take him anywhere in the company vehicle, and he's like, please? I really don't know where I am. Can you come with me and help me get there? Now I'm seriously weirded out, and I start wondering if this is some kind of ambush or whatever. I told him I could call him a taxi to take him where he wants to go. I pull out my phone and he just goes, no, and walks away really quickly. But he doesn't walk out of the park. He walks back into the fucking trees. I got right in my fucking truck and got out of there. Fuck the paint or whatever I was working on. I looked into my mirror to see where he was as I was leaving, and he was standing right in the tree line again. I don't know how he could have gotten there so fast, but this time I know that fucker didn't have a face. He just watched me leave. Right before I turned the corner, he took a big step back into the trees and kind of dissolved. I guess. Maybe it was just so dark he blended in, but it looked more like he just melted away. Interestingly, right after this guy finished his story, someone else piped up with another one, but with a slightly different twist. You know, actually, I had something weird happen to me like that a while back. I was out doing some trail scouting, and I was in the middle of nowhere, figured out where we were going to have to run this trail through. I hadn't seen anyone for probably a good 2 hours, so I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going. I was just looking at the ground for the most part. Then, out of nowhere, I crested this little hill and ran right into this guy. He was older, probably in his 60s, and I started to apologize for running into him. Then I noticed his face. I probably looked like a complete douchebag because I stopped and just stared at him. It took me a second to figure out what was wrong with this guy's face, but it was huge. I know it sounds weird, but that's the best way I can describe it. His head wasn't big or anything, that was pretty normal, but the amount of space his face took up was just way too much. Like, if you look at someone's face and enlarge it by 2 times, kind of like that. He doesn't say anything, he just kind of looks at me. I back up and was kind of stuttering and kept saying how sorry I was. Went around him and got the fuck out of there to do what I needed to do. The whole time, I kept looking behind me because I didn't want this dude to just pop up or something. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear to you, that was one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. I switched the topic to the stairs a little bit later. There was a definite switch in enthusiasm. No one spoke up at first. There was a real stigma about discussing them, even when we are away from work. I broke the ice with a story of my own, and the guy who told the story about the faceless man told this one, albeit pretty quietly. A couple years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend. We were out about 2 miles from the road at this one site I know. We went to bed that night, but we couldn't sleep because someone interjected with a funny off-color comment. We were all dangerously close to going off on another subject, but I got us back on track. Yeah, real funny fucker. No, it was because we kept hearing this grinding noise. My brother used to grind his teeth in his sleep, and it kind of reminded me of that. My girlfriend was absolutely freaking out, but I just kept telling her to ignore it because I've heard it before. You just kind of have to ignore it. It does eventually go away. You guys know what I mean. We all knew what he meant. So eventually, I get her to go to sleep, but I woke up probably 2 hours later because something was just off. I rolled over and she wasn't there. I kind of freaked out because he thought for a second, then took a very long drink. Anyway, I ran out of the tent calling her name, but she didn't go far. She was standing right at the edge of the camp, looking at something in the trees that I couldn't see. She was really pale. The fire was low but bright enough to see. Anyway, I ran up to see what she was doing, and she was dead asleep. But her eyes were open. She had this real spaced out look, you know? So I put my arm around her to lead her back, but she wouldn't move. She just said really quietly something like, "I have to go now, Eddie. I have to go. It's here." I was like, "You're just sleepwalking. Come on, let's go back to bed." But she wouldn't budge. She just kept standing there saying that she had to go. I looked where she was looking, and there was a fucking staircase right there, maybe 15 yards away. Gray one, concrete. She started to walk towards it, but I yanked her back and that woke her up. She looked at me like I was out of my fucking mind, and she asked what the fuck she's doing out of the tent. I didn't tell her anything. I just told her that she was sleepwalking. The grinding was gone, so she just went back to the tent and fell asleep again. I don't know. I just don't like thinking about it, you know? We all knew what he meant. You guys remember that kid with I can't remember what it was. Some kind of brain fuck up? Not Downs, but something like it. Someone else brought it up. Well, I got to read the report he gave when they found him about a week after he went missing. And it was fucked up beyond belief. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt because who knows what the kid actually thinks is real, but some of this stuff, I don't think he could have made it up. Like what? Well, first of all, he talked about the stairs. He said he had been watching his dad build a fire and the stairs came up to him. He said he had to go up them or something bad would happen. The cops didn't really understand what he was talking about after that, but he just kept saying, like the campfire, over and over and over. He kept mentioning sounds, but he couldn't say what sounds, just that it was loud and he covered his ears so he couldn't hear them. But the thing I remember most is, when they asked him where exactly he had gone, he said, "I was right here," and he kept pointing at himself. And they thought that he meant that he had never left. He said that he wasn't scared because the stairs were there, and they talked to him, but not like people talk. Like I said, it was really convoluted and hard to understand, and I have the feeling the cops didn't take most of it down. They just ended up saying that the kid had some kind of amnesia or fugue. They didn't think any foul play was involved. Doesn't really explain why he came back a week later, perfectly fine without a speck of dirt on him, and well fed. But hey, what the cops say, goes. There's still a lot of questions that I want to answer. I'll continue to ask around and find out whatever I can. The next update should be soon, though. Thank you for being patient. This is going to be my final update for now. Things have deteriorated here to a degree that I couldn't foresee. I didn't know exactly how much writing about these things that are happening here would affect every single aspect of my life, and maybe it was stupid of me. Maybe I should have considered it more seriously, but honestly, I just thought that I was writing about a few things that people would want to hear. I didn't think it would get this much attention. People ask me about the stairs now. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen, and I never really know what to say. My bosses know that someone is talking about them. I'm sure that if they know, the higher-ups know. And I can tell you that they are not happy about it. I have been formally told that I am not to speak a word about them to anyone anymore, which is part of the reason that this is my final update. I can't risk my job for this. As much as it's been wonderful to get to know you and to get all these things off my mind, I still do love my work. I need to be out there. If anything, my being aware of what's really going on is enough reason to stick it out. I may not be able to tell people what's out here, but if I see them, I can direct traffic somewhere safer. Because of the amount of attention these stories have gotten, I've heard a lot of stories being swapped back and forth. I've heard so many that I can't even remember most of them. The ones that I do remember, I wish I could forget. One of the stories that made the rounds was a young woman who had disappeared upstate. Initially, everyone assumed that she was a runaway. She didn't come from a great home life, so it wasn't really a surprise that she had chosen to just cut and run. But people started coming forward saying that they had seen her around the park shortly before she vanished. So some of the rangers in the area were sent out to make sure she hadn't hung herself or something on any of the back trails. It took them a while, but they did find her. Well, not all of her. Just half of her tongue and a quarter of her lower jaw. Very clean cuts from what I've heard. They never found the rest of her. So many stories about children. So many of them going missing and turning up in caves, wedged in impossibly tight spaces. So many of them found on mountain peaks or at the bottom of sheer gullies. Missing shoes, missing socks, or with both, found in perfectly good condition despite being miles and miles away from where they vanished. So many stories about black-eyed people wandering around the woods calling out into the night, mimicking the sounds of running water or bobcats screaming. One man in particular goes to every news station he thinks will listen to him, and he tells them all the same story. He was deer hunting and he was camped out in a very remote area of the park, and he was woken up because of something scraping against his tent. He thought that it was a raccoon or a fox, until the thing pressed its face against the door of the tent, at which point he could make out that it clearly had a human nose and mouth. He kicked at it, but it leaped back and was gone by the time he opened up the tent flap, gun at his side. He fired 2 warning shots, but when the sound faded, he heard a twig snap behind him. There was a man standing at the edge of the campsite. This man was not wearing any clothing. He also didn't possess any kind of human flesh. As the hunter described it, it looked like an amalgamation of raw meat and hair, as if someone had scooped up roadkill and molded it into a vague shape of a man. His face was lumpy, and it only had the rough approximation of an actual human face. The thing opened its lopsided mouth, and the sound came out of it was the sound of the gun that the hunter had fired earlier. It did this twice before mimicking the sound of the zipper, and then just fleeing off into the night. Another story is one of a young couple out for a hike in one of the more rocky areas of the park. This was reported to me yesterday, that they had seen something strange out on a peak that I'm very familiar with. They were taking turns looking through binoculars when the man noticed a hiker climbing up a very steep part of the cliff face. He watched the man scale the slope but it didn't occur to him until after the incident was over that this person had no climbing gear. When the climber reached the top of the peak, which was about 5 miles away, he then turned and faced the young man. He said whoever, or whatever this person was looking right at him. The climber waved in an exaggerated manner before snapping himself in half at the waist, sideways, and leaping off the peak. The young man didn't say where the climber landed. I sent them on their way with assurances that I would have it checked out. I lied. I won't be turning in a report because there are 10 others exactly like it. The climber is well known in the area. I don't even question it anymore. There are so many things that I will never understand about my job, and it would take me years to relate all of the things that I've heard over the past few months. When my job isn't in jeopardy, I will come back. It may be in a different format, but I'll come back. Thank you all for sticking by my side and enjoying the things I've talked about. If you do go out in the woods, I encourage you to be safe. Bring food, water, survival equipment. Let people know where you're going and when you'll be back. Do not go on uncharted paths unless you know exactly what you're doing. And above all, don't touch them, don't look at them, don't go up them.